As part of our discussion of the various biogeochemical cycles, we did talk about food chains and how different organisms in an ecological community interact with each other. And an ecological community, again, is just the living parts of any given ecosystem. A community is a group of populations, and a population is all the members of a given species interacting with each other in the same place and time. So, group of populations, that means a community is all of the species within an ecosystem, so all the living parts of the ecosystem and how they interact with each other, what the various jobs are, who's the top predator, who's prey, what are the main producers in this area, which ones return more nitrogen to the soil, what are the main decomposers, who are the scavengers in this ecosystem, are there any symbiotic interactions? Those are all community level considerations. And we talked about how plants and algae and blue-green bacteria are producers. They're able to take energy through the process of photosynthesis and store it as chemical potential energy in the form of biomass, a material that can be eaten by higher levels of the food chain by consumers, and then that supplies energy to all of the higher levels of that food chain. I also mentioned the idea that any organism that needs to eat another organism to survive, regardless of whether that organism is a plant or an animal or fungus, any organism that needs to eat other organisms to survive is called a consumer. And the herbivores, the ones that eat the plant matter or the ones that eat the producers, are called primary consumers. They're the first step up in that food chain, the first level up. And the levels of a food chain are referred to as trophic levels. And the entire feeding structure of the community is referred to as the trophic structure. Troph means to feed, so the feeding structure, the trophic structure of the community. Trophic level, the feeding level of the food chain. So you have the producers at the very bottom of this trophic structure, supplying all of that energy to the higher levels. And then the primary consumers are the next trophic level up. And then anything that eats a primary consumer we would refer to as a secondary consumer. Okay? So a secondary consumer eats a diet of primary consumers. Now that would be either carnivores, organisms that eat specifically other animals in order to survive, or it may be some forms of omnivore. Omnivores are organisms that can feed at multiple levels. Now, if there's an organism that eats specifically secondary consumers, they are a higher level predator, we refer to them as tertiary consumers. So primary, secondary, and then number 3 is tertiary. It goes 1, 2, 3 like that. And then if there's a level even higher than that, the organisms that feed on the tertiary consumers are referred to as quaternary consumers. Now, you might think it just keeps going like that, right? The ones that feed on the quaternary consumers get their own name, and then the ones that feed on them get their own name, and up and up and up. And it would, but most ecosystems are limited to quaternary consumers. They only have this many levels of the food chain. And that is because any given ecosystem is only going to occupy a certain amount of territory. There's going to be a maximum amount of space that ecosystem has. Say we're talking about a forest and it has a total size of 500 acres. That's the maximum amount of photosynthesis available, right? The sun can only hit that 500 acres. There's a certain amount of energy in that sun, so there's only so much energy that the plants can get from the sun to make available for the other levels of the food chain. Now, that energy is going to be converted into the plant's biomass. It's going to be stored in sugars and organic molecules, but a lot of that energy is actually going to go to keeping the plant alive, and a lot of it's going to be lost as waste heat, as we talked about before. So only a very small percentage of that energy actually ends up being stored in the form of chemical potential energy, somewhere around 10%, a very small portion of it. And only the energy that is stored as biomass, that's actually stored in physical material that organisms can eat, can actually be transferred to the next highest trophic structure up. So only material that's actually stored as plant growth, as biomass, can then be eaten by the primary consumers, right? And therefore, whatever's actually stored there is all of the energy available to that next highest level, the herbivores. Whatever amount of energy that is, most of it is going to be lost through waste, through inefficiency. A lot of it's going to go to just keeping the organisms alive. You need energy to keep your heart beating. You need energy to keep your metabolism going. You need energy to be able to move around and hunt and think and breathe and just be a living thing. So a lot of that energy doesn't get stored in your body as biomass. You are constantly burning calories, energy, just as a consequence of being a living thing. And so only the portion of the energy that is stored as new growth, as body fat or muscle or tissue or bone on those herbivores, those primary consumers, is available as energy for the next level up, which is only going to be about, again, 10% of what they were able to get from the producers. So that means there's actually less available energy for the secondary consumers than there were for the primary consumers. And the total amount of energy is constrained by the total space that the ecosystem can occupy. And every trophic level that you move up, the same effect occurs again. You have about 1/10 the total amount of energy that was available to the trophic level just below. And that means there can be fewer and fewer organisms that are actually sitting at that higher trophic level. And you might be familiar with the idea that certain top tier predators, like say a Bengal tiger, right? That's a apex predator. They need really, really big ranges, right? Many, many square miles in order to roam around and search for food. You can't have too many tigers in the exact same section of forest because there's not enough herbivores there in order to sustain that population. And there can't be enough herbivores there because there's not enough plant life doing enough photosynthesis to sustain that population. So the reason why apex predators, like on this image that we have here, we have a red-tailed hawk and we have a killer whale, the reason why they typically need very large areas to be able to roam around and hunt in ultimately has to do with the amount of space required to capture enough energy from sunlight to then funnel that energy up through the trophic structure of the ecosystem to eventually get to them, losing a little bit of that energy with every step that it moves through along the way. So why are most ecosystems limited to a certain number of steps in the food chain, such that only the tertiary or quaternary consumers are going to be the highest level predators that you have? It's because if you tried to put another tier of predator above this, they would need an even larger amount of territory to occupy, and possibly one that's bigger than the entire ecosystem itself, so there just simply wouldn't be enough calories available to actually sustain that high of a level of predator. Now, if you're having trouble visualizing what I'm talking about right away, don't worry, I have some slides that'll hopefully help you out with that in just a little bit. So for right now, let's start with the basics. The trophic structure, the feeding structure, is the feeding relationships amongst various species in a community. A community's trophic structure determines the passage of energy and nutrients from plants and other photosynthetic organisms, the producers, to the herbivores, and then to higher level consumers, which you can also refer to as predators in most cases. On the right-hand side, it shows two possible food chains, two possible trophic structures, one for a land-based ecosystem and the other for an aquatic ecosystem. The land-based ecosystem has the photosynthetic organism, the producer, the plant here, as a flower, and it's able to capture energy from sunlight. That energy is stored in the plant tissues, and those plant tissues are then eaten by the herbivore, which is this cricket here, and some portion of the mass of the plant that this cricket eats, the energy that's in that is going to be used to build up the size of the cricket, right? It's going to grow from a baby cricket up to an adult cricket, and then it's going to use its additional energy to be able to reproduce and make more crickets. So a little bit of the energy that it captures from its food will go to increasing the overall biomass of crickets. But because of the inefficiency of energy transfer, the number of crickets, or the total biomass of crickets, I should say, is always going to be less than the number of plants, or the biomass of plants. You're always going to have a little bit less every time you move up a level on this trophic structure. The cricket will then be eaten by a secondary consumer, in this case a mouse, which is actually a kind of omnivore, because mice can eat both plants and some kinds of animals, insects in this case. The mouse is going to use some of the energy from the cricket in order to increase its own size, in order to reproduce, but a lot of that biomass is just going to be excreted as waste, or the energy from it is going to go to keeping the mouse's heart beating, to keeping it alive, and it's not going to be used to actually increase its own size. Only the energy that is stored in the mass of the mouse is actually going to be transferred to the next higher level predator, which is this rattlesnake up here. So that's our tertiary consumer. Tertiary means 3, so we went from primary to secondary to tertiary. Tertiary consumer, it eats the mouse, and then this organism is in turn eaten by the quaternary consumer, which is this red-tailed hawk in this example. The red-tailed hawk is an apex predator in this ecosystem because there are no organisms that prey on this red-tailed hawk. It sits at the top of the trophic structure, the top of the food chain, if you like. But since the total mass of crickets has to be smaller than the total mass of plants in the ecosystem, and the total mass of mice has to be smaller than the total mass of crickets, and the total mass of snakes has to be smaller than the total mass of mice, the total available food available to this top tier predator is relatively small compared to the lower trophic levels. In order to meet its calorie needs, it's going to need to spend a large portion of its day flying all over this ecosystem looking for snakes to be able to feed on. Now that's kind of a simplified version because obviously hawks also eat mice and rodents and other types of animals. But one thing I really want you to understand and come away from at the end of this unit is that the total amount of stored biomass energy at each trophic level is lower than the one right below it. So simplifying it a little bit helps to convey that idea. On the right-hand side, we have an aquatic ecosystem. The producers are not necessarily plants. They might be phytoplankton, which is a kind of protist. Protist is not a plant, it's not a bacteria, it's not an animal, it's a different kingdom of organisms. But they too are able to do photosynthesis, and therefore they are considered to be producers. Phytoplankton are often eaten by zooplankton, microscopic animal-like organisms that are going to act as our primary consumers in this ecosystem. Those zooplankton are then eaten by smaller fish, carnivores, and then those smaller fish are eaten by slightly larger fish, and then those larger fish can be eaten by a top-tier predator, in this case a mammal, a killer whale. What was true of the ecosystem on the left is also true of the ecosystem on the right here. If we were to weigh up all of the biomass of the phytoplankton in this ecosystem, just get all of the phytoplankton and just weigh them, they would weigh more than all of the zooplankton, and the total amount of calories, the total amount of energy contained in all of that phytoplankton, because of how much more mass there is, would be higher than the amount of energy stored in the total amount of zooplankton. And then the total amount of zooplankton in terms of biomass and energy would be greater than the total amount of secondary consumers, these fish up here. And the same would hold true for every trophic level that we moved up, until we reached that killer whale, which is an apex predator that also needs very, very large areas of territory in order to be able to hunt and gather enough calories. On the next slide, we add a little bit of vocabulary. So the trophic level that supports all of the other trophic levels are the producers. And any organism that can secure energy from non-living sources, the sun in most cases, is called an autotroph. Auto means self, and as I mentioned before, troph means to feed. So this is a self-feeding organism. They do not need to rely on consuming other organisms in order to meet their energy requirements. They are self-feeders, autotrophs. Producers are autotrophs. You can link those two concepts together in your head. This is also one of the main criteria that defines what a plant is. Plants are, by definition, multicellular autotrophs. There's some other criteria in there as well, which helps separate them from certain kinds of protists that also happen to be multicellular autotrophs, like giant seaweed. But all plants are autotrophs. All organisms in trophic levels above the producers are consumers, and they are also referred to as heterotrophs. Hetero means different, or in this case you could think about it as other, and again troph means feeder. So these are other feeders. They feed on other organisms in order to survive. We have self-feeders and other feeders. So any organism that meets its energy requirements, that gets its daily calories from consuming a living thing, or a recently living thing in most cases, is a heterotroph, another feeder, or a consumer. Primary consumers are the herbivores, which eat the plants. This next slide has a few more vocabulary terms, but we've already kind of covered them, so I'll just read through them. Above the level of primary consumer are carnivores, and sometimes omnivores, which eat the consumers from the level below. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, quaternary consumers eat tertiary consumers. Quaternary means 4. Now, there are also organisms in every ecosystem that don't neatly fit into that scheme. We've talked about some of them with the biogeochemical cycles, the decomposers. These are prokaryotes and fungi. Prokaryotes are bacteria and things like that, which secrete enzymes that digest molecules in organic matter and convert them back to inorganic forms. The decomposers are what take the detritus in the leaf litter, the fallen leaves from trees, or carcasses from dead animals, or any leftover animal waste in terms of feces and things like that, and they break it down into soil. They break it down into the nutrients that are then available for the producers to be able to use again. Fungi, incidentally, are more like animals than they are like plants. They are also heterotrophs, but they are different from animals in that animals digest things internally, whereas fungi grow on top of whatever it is they're consuming, and they excrete enzymes to break down whatever it is they're growing on and then absorb nutrition kind of externally. I mention this because often students are surprised to discover that funguses can't do photosynthesis, or at least the vast majority of funguses cannot do photosynthesis. Now, there is another vocabulary word on this slide that I don't think I've mentioned in any of the previous videos, and that is detritivores. These are not decomposers. These are typically animals that eat dead material. They consume detritus, and they take it through essentially a second level of processing before it gets to the decomposers. So your jackals and your vultures, things like that search out dead material or carcasses and then consume that and then excrete it as waste to break it down for the decomposers to then be able to break it down again. They are called detritivores. And detritus is dead material. Vor is another word that means eater. So they're literally called death eaters, detritivores. There are many other examples of detritivores as well. Earthworms and a lot of insects consume leaf litter. They're just specialists in consuming all of the dead material that's already sitting on the forest floor. They don't spend a lot of time hunting other types of animals. They just eat what's already kind of laying around. So they're the cleanup crew of forests and ecosystems. Now, obviously, no ecosystem anywhere is going to be as simple as having a single kind of producer, a single kind of primary consumer, a single kind of secondary consumer, on and on and on. And most organisms are going to be able to fulfill multiple different roles, or need to fulfill multiple different roles in order to meet their calorie needs or be able to compete with the other organisms in their environment. An additional level of nuance that we can add into a trophic structure is to include the omnivores. Omnivores are any organism that eats producers and consumers, so they eat at multiple trophic levels. They eat at the producer level and they eat at the consumer level. When you're trying to place an omnivore in a trophic structure, you put it at the highest trophic level that it feeds at. So this mouse here eats both plants and it eats the insects that are herbivores. And if you eat an herbivore, that makes you a secondary consumer. So even though it also eats producers, we put it at the same tier as the secondary consumers, which is why it's found right up here. And the same would go for this bird who gets nectar from the cactus flowers, but also eats insects in the local area. When you expand a trophic structure to include the omnivores and also all of the other primary and secondary consumers and all of the different producers that you have in an ecosystem, it stops being a food chain and you get something more akin to a food web. This may seem a lot more complex, but it is a much more honest depiction of what the flow of energy and resources from one trophic level to the next to the next to the next in each ecosystem actually looks like. The last thing that I want to talk about in Unit 1 are these concepts of biomass and energy, which I've talked about a little bit already, but I want to assign some numbers to these ideas and give you some examples so we can really nail down this concept, make sure that everyone understands it before we get to any kind of exam. So, biomass is the organic matter produced by plants and other photosynthetic producers. It's the total dry weight of all of the living organisms that can be supported at each trophic level. So the biomass available at the producer level is effectively equal to, if you were to take all the plants in an ecosystem, dry them out so that we're not considering water weight as part of this, and then weigh up how much material you had. Because energy flow in ecosystems has to do with the trophic structure, with eating material, only the energy that's stored in that biomass is available to the herbivores. So the biomass of the producers is equivalent to the total amount of energy that's going to be available to all higher trophic levels. Within the ecosystem, a certain amount of energy and biomass will be stored at the producer level, a certain amount will be stored at the primary consumer level, a certain amount will be stored at the secondary consumer level, and so on. But because of the physics involved, because of the rules of energy transfer, the amount of energy and biomass at the producer level is always going to be the largest number, and there will be less available at each higher trophic level. So what is energy? What is this concept of energy that I keep talking about? Energy, defined by physics, is the capacity to do work by performing mechanical, physical, chemical, or electrical tasks. So mechanical tasks would be moving around, pumping blood through a heart, all of the kind of behaviors that you would associate with perhaps animals. But there's also mechanical tasks that take place at the cellular level that all living things perform. Chemical tasks would be things like metabolism, all of that photosynthesis and cellular respiration, that all requires energy to actually do the process. Even though those processes are involved with securing energy, energy is required to get them started in the first place. Now, I've mentioned before that the way that we get energy, or the primary source of energy for all ecosystems, is going to be the sun. But we haven't quantified it. So each day, the Earth receives 10 to the 19th kilocalories of solar energy. A kilocalorie is the scientific way of describing a calorie, like you would talk about it in terms of like a nutritional calorie, right? When you say that sandwich contains 600 calories, it's a kilocalorie, same thing. 10 to the 19th means a 1 with 19 zeros at the end of it. It is a big, big, big number, equivalent to the amount of energy released by 100 million atomic bombs. That's how much energy that the Earth receives from the sun per day. So the amount of energy that is available to ecosystems at the producer level, if they can actually secure it, is high, but they cannot utilize all that energy. There's limitations to what photosynthesis can actually do. One of the biggest ones being how much actual space is there for sunlight to hit that ecosystem. The actual territory covered in green matter is going to limit how much photosynthesis can occur. plants in an ecosystem will actually compete with each other in order to maximize how much sunlight they are receiving. They will tilt their leaves in order to receive more sunlight, or they will try to outgrow each other in order to cast the other plants directly around them in shade. This is one of the reasons why trees will grow really, really tall. They get lots of photosynthesis because their leaves are up at the top of the canopy, but all of the plants down below, they have reduced ability to do photosynthesis because they are in the shade. So all of the plants in an ecosystem do photosynthesis as much as they can, and whatever amount of that energy they can store and use for new growth, that becomes biomass, and the biomass is where the energy is stored. So let's say we have a leaf. On this next slide I have a leaf, and this leaf, we're going to say, contains 100 kilocalories of energy. Calories is just a measurement of energy, so it's got 100 units of energy in it. And this caterpillar wants to get energy by eating this leaf. Now, about half of the energy that's available in this leaf is not going to get processed whatsoever. It's just going to be lost as waste. It's going to be lost as feces. It's just going to be excreted from the caterpillar, and he's not going to be able to utilize any of that. So half of it not getting used. 35 kilocalories from that 100, so about 35% or about 40%, are going to be used for cellular respiration to unlock energy for that food, for keeping the caterpillar alive, for doing its metabolism, for moving around, for keeping fluids moving through it, for being able to breathe, for just being a caterpillar alive in the world. It takes a lot of energy to just keep you alive. And only what's remaining after energy has been used to keep you alive and energy has been excreted as waste is going to be what's left over to actually store as new growth, to make the caterpillar larger, or after it finishes its life cycle and reproduces, to make more caterpillars. So that can be stored as new growth. Only about 10 to 15 kilocalories are going to be stored as new growth, as actual biomass at that primary consumer level. This isn't unique to caterpillars. This is true of all herbivores, of all consumers, actually. So however much energy there was stored at the producer level, only about 10% of it can be stored at the primary consumer level. It's going to be about 1/10 the amount. There has to be less energy stored at the primary consumer level than there is at the producer level, because some is used for other purposes and some is wasted. So then, if you're a caterpillar and you can eat all of the plants in an ecosystem, you could eat all of the plants, the total amount of calories available to you is actually pretty high, as opposed to an animal that eats a diet of caterpillars. There's going to be about 1/10 the amount of energy available to you because there's less biomass. There's less energy stored in biomass at that level. The next slide tries to give you some numbers attached to this and a pictographic example. So here we have the sun is shining, and we have this field of producers. This big green rectangle represents a big field of plants that's able to do photosynthesis. And let's say that this field of producers contains 10,000 kilocalories. All right, well, it's going to be consumed, it's going to be eaten by the next tier, which are going to be crickets. But because of the limitations we talked about before, only about 1,000 kilocalories is going to be stored as biomass on those crickets. And that's all of the energy that's going to be available to the secondary consumers. So when the secondary consumers want to feast on these crickets, they're only going to be able to get 100 kilocalories from the original 10,000. If that's not enough calories to sustain their diet, then they're going to need to hunt across a much larger territory in order to meet their calorie needs. They're going to need a bigger ecosystem of producers in order to be able to get enough calories to feed them. I want to make it clear, this is not about how much energy there is per gram of plant matter versus per gram of insect or per gram of meat or something like that. Obviously, there's more energy, there's more calories in an ounce of meat than there is in an ounce of salad. but it's about the total amount of energy in all of the plant matter in an entire ecosystem versus the total amount of energy in the next highest trophic level. From that original field of plants, the snake, our tertiary consumer, is only going to be able to receive about 10 kilocalories. And it's for the same reason as we talked about with the caterpillars. At each level, half of the energy is going to be lost as waste, and about 35-40% of it is going to be used to just keep each organism alive and thriving. And only the excess energy that is actually stored on their bodies as muscle, as fat, as tissue of some sort, can actually be eaten to get energy. So that's the only amount that can actually be transferred to the next highest trophic level. And hopefully this helps you see why the higher up the food chain you go, the higher up the trophic structure you go, the more territory those predators are going to require to meet their calorie needs. Because if this entire field of producers, this entire field of plants, has 10,000 kilocalories, but only 10 can actually get up to this snake, that snake's going to need many, many, many fields of these plants in order to be able to get enough calories to actually sustain its diet. It turns out that last fact has interesting implications for sustainable agriculture, but we'll talk about that at the very end. First, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, I've put 3 organisms up on this slide. This is a trophic structure of my backyard. I have a lot of clover in my yard. I kind of like clover. It returns nitrogen to the soil naturally, and I find it to be a pretty attractive ground cover plant. And you know who else finds it to be a very attractive plant are groundhogs. And there's a family of groundhogs that lives adjacent to my house. And those groundhogs are very much beloved by the family of foxes that lives under my shed. So the clover is nice enough to keep my lawn fertilized, the groundhogs are nice enough to keep the clover in check, and the foxes are nice enough to keep the groundhogs in check. Now, here's the questions. First, and make sure and actually try to answer these. Like, take a moment, pause the video, and check your understanding. What trophic level does the fox occupy in the food chain depicted above? Trophic levels are producers, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer. What trophic level does the fox occupy in the very simple food chain that we have presented here? The second question is, how much energy will be stored on the fox population as biomass, assuming the clovers initially contain 1,350 kilocalories? How much of that energy will end up being stored as biomass on the fox population? Go ahead and try to work out the answer to those 2 questions. Pause the video. And assuming you've unpaused the video now, I will reveal the answers. So, the clover is our photosynthetic organism here. It is an autotroph, which means a self-feeder. So it is the producer. It's the one that's able to secure energy from sunlight and put it into the rest of the biosphere. Our groundhog is an herbivore. It's the one eating the producer, which makes it a primary consumer. The fox is eating the groundhog, so it is behaving as a secondary consumer in this food chain. So if you said that the fox is a secondary consumer in the food chain depicted above, you were correct. How much energy will be stored on the fox population as biomass if the clovers initially contained 1,350 kilocalories? Well, assuming that you went with the slightly simplified math from earlier, where you're just getting 10% energy transfer in terms of biomass from one trophic level to the other, then you would assume that, okay, the clover has 1,350 calories. Therefore, the groundhogs would be able to store about 135 of those calories on their bodies as biomass. And then the fox, if it eats the groundhogs, would be able to store 13.5 of those calories, of those kilocalories, on their bodies as biomass. Whenever I have an exam question like this, I will always just assume 10% energy transfer from one trophic level to the next trophic level, because it makes the math much simpler, and I'm more interested in you understanding the concept than doing a slightly more complicated math problem that would just require you to bring a calculator. Finally, I mentioned that this concept has some implications for sustainable agriculture, and that is because as humans we are herbivores and we eat both plants and animals, or we have the capacity to eat both plants and animals. And therefore, if we have a single plot of land, we can use that to grow a number of vegetables. The types of vegetables that we grow could be the ones that humans eat. You get a lot of calories to supply to people, like beans and soy and corn, and grains and things like that, for human consumption. And you could sustain about 10 people with a given plot of land with the amount of crops that you would be able to grow on essentially a vegetarian diet. The same plot of land could also be used to grow vegetables or crops for feeding to cattle. And then those cattle, you could sustain a number of cattle using that same plot of land, but you would be able to feed substantially fewer humans with those cattle. So ignoring momentarily that most people eat a mixture of plants and meat, if you were to sustain a human off just a diet of meat, the same plot of land that would be required to sustain their diet in terms of calories could be used to sustain about 10 human vegetarians. Now, obviously, gram for gram, meat is going to have a higher calorie density than just about any vegetable crop that you could grow. That's not what this is saying. What it's saying is, in order to get those calories, you need to actually capture the energy from sunlight in the first place. So you would need a similar plot of land to capture all of that energy through vegetation and then feed it to the cattle, which would then all need to be used to feed a single person who is acting as a secondary consumer, whereas you could use the exact same plot of land to feed about 10 people who are behaving as primary consumers. Agriculture actually turns out to be one of the most profound ways in which we affect the environment. First, we just require a lot of space, so we clear out a lot of natural ecosystems. We do a lot of habitat destruction in order to spread out and convert more and more of the Earth's surface into tillable land or agricultural land or grazing land for prairies and things like that. We've also discussed the effects of nutrient pollution from artificial fertilizers. In addition to being one of the main users of freshwater resources, which we earlier said is a very overtaxed natural resource. We also talked much earlier in the unit about the concept of the ecological footprint, the amount of total land area, the amount of space that you would require to maintain your personal lifestyle. So with all these ideas in mind, eating a more meat-based diet actually turns out to just require fundamentally more space, more and more and more space in order to maintain that lifestyle. It is perhaps one of the easiest ways that a single individual can reduce their impact on the environment to simply shift their diet slightly more towards a plant-based focus. This graph I got from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, and it shows the usage of agricultural land across the world and what it's actually used for. And you can actually see that 77% of agricultural land worldwide is actually used for livestock. That's used for grazing livestock and for growing food, for growing crops that is then used to feed to livestock. So a lot of the land is used for crops, but those crops then are intended for the animal agriculture industry. Only 23% of the crops that we're growing or the land that we're using for growing food is for vegetation that is meant for human consumption. However, in terms of actual calorie supply, 83% of the calories that humans consume come from plants, from grains and things like that, from carbohydrates, and only 17% from meat and dairy. And in terms of protein supply, people always talk about the amount of protein in meat, and that's true. Meat is very high in protein, but protein is in every single thing that you eat. 67% of our protein worldwide, not in the average American's diet necessarily, comes from plant-based nutrition. From a sustainability perspective, this is not the most efficient approach that we could take to agriculture. However, as a luxury item, meat is very, very profitable. Now, your textbook would cite the concept of full cost pricing that you may remember from much earlier in the unit, and say that perhaps removing certain government subsidies that artificially cheapen the price of meat would be one possible way to reduce the overall impact of these goods. What I find most interesting about this idea is that this is the first time in the course where we take a look at how ecosystems work, we're taking a look at natural environmental science, we're taking a look at physics in terms of energy flow and calories and how they're transferred from one trophic level to the other. And then we can apply that idea to human societies, and then we arrive at economic ideas as a result. Again, ecological problems are frequently economic problems as well. And you'll notice this kind of pattern repeating as we make our way through the course.